Hey there, I hope you're doing well. My name is Arya and today we're going to look at some more Reddit stories. If you enjoy Reddit stories, consider liking, subscribing, and maybe hitting that notification bell too. Let's get started with today's first story. Much love, everyone. Today's first story comes from I found a secret phone in cheating wife's bag and recorded everything. I never expected life to spiral into such chaos. For years we had what seemed like a perfect life, a stable home, happy kids and a trusting relationship, or so I thought, but things changed fast as cracks appeared in our marriage. I no longer recognized our life. It started small, missed dinners, distant talks and excuses that didn't make sense. I brushed it off thinking, every marriage has rough spots, but soon I was questioning everything, especially Richard. In the months before that fateful day we were like strangers under the same roof. He came home late and when we talked it was tense. I tried to hold on for the kids, hoping things would return to normal. Then the night I received those damning photos. My world fell apart. Everything I believed about my husband, our love and our life shattered instantly. Every day followed the same disturbing routine. Just before school ended, the familiar old Volvo would park nearby. Never too close. One day, a mother saw the driver peering through binoculars and called the police as the kids poured out of school. I saw him get out of the car even from 400 yards away. I recognized his frame, his stressed gestures. He showed something to the police officer. "Mommy. Why are you crying?" Thomas asked. "Are you hurt?" "No, sweetie. The wind just blew something into my eyes." I lied, hugging them and walking to the car. I glanced back and saw him still talking to the officer. 2 days later, I had Penny pick up the kids within minutes. Richard approached the Meline, spotted him first and ran to him with Thomas following. He hugged them tightly and I watched crying. He crouched to speak with them, then turned to Penny. I walked over to him. "Hello, Richard, it's been a while." His eyes were filled with anger. "That was your choice, not mine." "What do you mean?" "I've never kept you from the kids." He pulled some papers from his jacket and handed them to me. "What do you call this?" I glanced at them and recognized only one phrase: restraining order. "I don't understand." "I never filed this. Well, someone did, Mommy." "Can Daddy come home with us?" Meline asked, tugging on my arm. Richard shook his head gently. "Not tonight, darling," as he turned to leave. He said over his shoulder, "By the way, I'll deny this meeting ever happened." "Richard, wait. Can I have those papers?" "No, it's my only copy. I'll send it anonymously." He hugged and kissed. The kids then walked away. They called out to him, but he didn't look back. I saw him wiping his eyes in the car. Penny stared at me in disbelief. "Tell me you didn't do this, Kath. Richard's a good dad." "I didn't, Penny," I replied firmly, "but I'm going to find out who did all the way home." I couldn't stop thinking about his face, desperate, broken and hurt. I tried to remind myself he deserved it. He had betrayed me by sleeping with another woman, less than 7 years of marriage, and he couldn't stay faithful. What was wrong with me? I loved him and did everything to keep myself in shape for him. I thought he was proud of me, but I was wrong. It had been nearly a year since those photos arrived. They left little to the imagination, a young blonde and him having Z in some shots. His face wasn't visible, but the tattoo gave it away. Property of Catherine Thompson with an arrow pointing down. I remembered when he got it on our first anniversary. I'd laughed then, but I wasn't laughing now. Looking at those pictures made me sick. How could he do this to me? I thought about Penny's words. He was always a great dad, deeply involved with Maddie and Tom. They adored him and I was surprised when he suddenly stopped seeing them for 3 months. There was no contact. Despite everything, I didn't hate him. I wouldn't stop him from seeing the kids as Richard walked away. He couldn't believe how quickly his life had fallen apart a year ago. He had a good job, a house, a loving wife and 2 beautiful children. Now it was all gone. He sat in his car, hitting his forehead on the steering wheel. How had one drunken night led to this? Normally he didn't drink much, but that night at the company party he felt lonely. Kath wasn't there because she was caring for her mom. So he drank more than usual. He couldn't remember anything after halfway through the night and woke up in a hotel room with a terrible hangover. The hotel said he had booked the room the week before, which made no sense when he returned to work. His colleagues were teasing him and his boss. Craig wasn't amused. I saw you leaving with a blonde woman Saturday night. Kath's a great girl and you're risking everything for a fling. Richard couldn't remember any of it, but Craig filled in the gaps. Richard had left the party with his arm around a mystery woman. Someone no one recognized. A week later, Kath came back from her mom's, and 2 days after that, Richard was kicked out of the house when she found the pictures. He moved in with his brother and soon received divorce papers. He never thought Kath would use the kids against him, but this restraining order made it impossible to arrange visits with them back at home. I gave the kids a snack and checked my email, but there was nothing from Richard while they worked on their homework. I started dinner wondering how things had gone so wrong. Tony got home around 5:30 p.m., greeted by grunts from the kids and a kiss from me. He had been my rock during the divorce, helping me find a good lawyer and securing a settlement. Richard didn't put up much of a fight when my solicitor threatened to limit his access to the kids. He gave in. I don't feel great about the settlement. It feels like I have everything and he has nothing. He even has to pay the mortgage on the house. He can't live in. Tony says it's Richard's fault for not fighting back and for cheating. I met Tony at work, where he's a solicitor and I work in the accounts department. We started going to lunch together and talked about our lives. He used to tell me he envied Richard for having a stable family over time. Tony became a close friend and confidant, and I shared everything with him. Even Richard's tattoo story as Tony went upstairs to change my thoughts. Dee drifted to Richard's tear-streaked face. The whole situation wasn't fair. He'd lost access to the kids. While I got everything, I teared up as I prepared dinner and Tony noticed. "What's wrong? You seem down tonight?" he asked. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press A. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories. I just saw someone from my past. They're not doing well, and I keep wondering if there's anything I can do to help. Tony shrugged. The only person who can help you is yourself. Winners and losers. That's life. You're probably right. My worrying won't change anything. I replied, though doubt lingered in my mind later, as I sent the kids to brush their teeth before bed. Thomas shouted, "I want Daddy to read me a story." Tony folded his newspaper and walked toward them, but Maddie cried out, "Not you. We want our real daddy." Tony's tone hardened. "Well, if your real daddy loved you, he'd be here, wouldn't he, Tony?" I yelled, rushing over as Maddie started crying. She looked up at me, eyes full of tears. "Daddy does love us. Doesn't he, Mommy?" "Of course he does, sweetie. He loves you more than anything." I don't know why Tony said that. Maddie sniffled. "He doesn't like Daddy." I tried to reassure her. "I'm sure Tony loves you too. He's just upset right now. I don't like him. I want to see Daddy." "I'm working on it, sweetie. Let's get you to bed and I'll figure out Daddy's visits." After tucking them in, I went downstairs still fuming. "Don't you ever talk to my kids like that again." Tony gave me a hard look. "Oh, they're your kids. Now I thought we agreed they'd be our kids. When I moved in, Richard will always be their father. That won't change." Tony crossed his arms. "Maybe I could have worded it better, but they need to know the truth. He's not part of their lives anymore." "When's the last time they saw him?" 3 months ago today, I said quietly. "He was with them at school when I was late." Tony's expression shifted. "Did you talk to him?" "No, he left before I arrived." "Typical." "What did you say?" Tony's voice grew tense. "I s him down. He didn't fight for anything. He got the house, the child support, the maintenance. He just gave in." Tony smirked. "We told him, give us what we want or you'll never see your kids again. He had no choice, then. Why isn't he using his visitation if the kids mean so much to him? I don't know, I muttered, but I saw how heartbroken he was today. There's got to be a reason. I didn't mention the restraining order, but a part of me suspected Tony knew more about it than he let on. I kept quiet, waiting for the chance to read it myself. I checked my email again, nothing from Richard. In desperation, I looked in the junk folder and found it, an attachment called injunction. No message, just the file. I printed it out and put it in my briefcase. Tony walked in with an overnight bag. I forgot to mention, I have to go to Southampton tomorrow. I won't be back until Friday evening. Just one night. You'll be back Friday? I asked. Yeah, for sure. How about we go out to dinner Friday night? I'll book a table, he offered, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around me. How about a little affection before I leave? Not tonight, Tony, I'm not in the mood. I pulled away from him. He sighed. Is this still about what I said to Maddie? Yes, it is. I can't believe you'd hurt a little girl's view of her father, just because you're jealous. I thought you were better than that. Jealous of him, really? Tony scoffed. Why else would you react like that when she prefers her dad? I challenged. Of course she prefers him, he said, frustrated. Hyun's been in her life forever. I've only been here 6 months. There was a pause and then Tony softened. I'm sorry, Kathy, you're right. We just need more time. She'll come around, especially since he's not visiting. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm going to bed, I said, walking away. Meanwhile, Rob noticed something was off with Richard, who looked exhausted and kept dropping his tools. Okay, what did she do? This time Rob asked, eyeing him. I'm fine, Rob muttered. Come on. I can tell something's up. Yesterday you seemed like you were doing better, but now we're back to square one, Rob said, standing up and looking down at Richard as they worked on a car engine. Richard hesitated. She says she knows nothing about the restraining order. Acted like she was confused when I showed it to her. You talked to her? Are you nuts? Your lawyer told you to stick to the order until it's lifted, Rob reminded him. Yeah, but they're not his kids, Rob. I had to see them. Richard said, his voice strained. Rob put a comforting arm around Richard's shoulders. Come on, Leighton, call it a night and grab a beer later. They sat in the kitchen, Richard with a beer, Rob with a coffee. So what happened today? Rob asked. I've been waiting outside the school for the past couple of weeks, just to catch a glimpse of Maddie and Tom. Richard admitted. Careful, Richie, that could get you in trouble. Yeah. I know, a cop already checked on me, but he understood he's divorced too. Richard said, stick to the story. What happened today? Kathy didn't show up. Her friend Penny picked up the kids, so I thought it was a good time to talk. You should have seen them, Rob. They were so happy to see me. I bet they were. How long has it been? Rob asked. Richard sighed. Too long, about 3 months anyway. While I was with them, Kathy showed up and acted like it was all my fault. I showed her the injunction and she claimed she didn't know about it. She looked me in the eyes and lied. If I hadn't seen her signature on it, might have believed her. How did she turn into this? The Kathy I knew wouldn't have done this, taken everything and kept me from my kids. Did I cause this, Rob? Did one mistake turn her into someone else? I doubt it was just you. That guy she's living with probably has a lot to do with it. So after I showed her the injunction, I left. Maddie wanted me to come home with them. As I walked away, Kathy asked for a copy of the injunction. Why would she do that? If she already has one, I don't get it either. I thought you two were solid, never expected her to react like this. To one mistake, it was just one mistake and I don't even remember it anyway. I told her I'd email her a copy tonight, so I should go. Do that. Be careful, Richie, that could count as contacting her. Don't worry, I'll set up a new Hotmail account and deny it. Richard headed to his room. Looking back, I can't pinpoint how I ended up living with Tony. There wasn't any great romance or falling in love. He was just always there after the photos. I leaned on him for support and he helped me through the divorce. He took control and I became dependent on him. He comforted me, took me out, and eventually we ended up in bed when he suggested moving in. It seemed like a good idea. I liked him. He was kind to me and the kids. I didn't feel passionate about him, but I thought it could work. Now I was seeing a different side of Tony, cruel and vindictive. Richard would never have said such hurtful things to the kids. If Tony was behind the injunction, it showed a side of him. I hadn't realized that night in bed Tony tried to cuddle, but I pulled away. I'm going to Maddie's room. I need sleep lying in her room. I thought about the injunction. It included false claims that Richard had threatened me and Tony, and my signature was at the bottom. I knew I hadn't made those statements. I decided to seek legal help. The next morning breakfast was tense. Tony wasn't happy about being left alone. The kids were upset with him and I was exhausted. I was relieved to drop the kids at school and head to work at work. I reviewed the restraining order again. The statement attributed to me were complete lies. The order had been requested by my firm Pendleton, Sims and Woodcock on behalf of Tony and me by mid-morning. I knew I needed to confront Mr. Michael Pendleton, the senior partner. I went to his office and knocked on the door. "Good morning, Kathleen. What can I do for you?" he asked, looking up from his desk. "I need help with a legal issue," I said, handing him the injunction papers. This was served on my husband, but I never made the statements in here. Yet my signature is on it. Mr. Pendleton furrowed his brow as he read through the document. "You're making a serious allegation. Are you saying you never requested this injunction?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. I never asked for it, and the statements inside, you're denying those as well." "I didn't make them, none of it is true." He looked up at me, measuring his words. "Then what do you need from me, Kathleen?" "I want the injunction overturned, so my kids can see their father, and I want to know who's behind this." Mr. Pendleton leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "You do realize that if Tony is involved, it could ruin his career?" I didn't know that I confessed, but my children need their father. If Tony falsified evidence, then he has to face the consequences. He nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. I'll investigate and get back to you this afternoon." Later, just as I was preparing to leave for the day, Mr. Pendleton called me back to his office. I quickly phoned Penny to ask if she could pick up the kids. "What if Richard shows up?" she asked, sounding worried. "Let him talk to them," I reassured her. "Just don't let him take them. I'm working on getting the order overturned. It doesn't apply to the kids." "So it's fine." After hanging up, I headed to Mr. Pendleton's office. He rose to greet me when I entered, his demeanor more formal than usual, as if I were a client rather than a colleague. "Kathleen, I'm glad you could come. I assume someone is handling the children's pickup." "Yes, everything's taken care of." "Thank you, Mr. Pendleton," I replied. He smiled slightly. "You're always so organized. Please have a seat." As I sat down, I noticed the tension in the way he steepled his fingers, clearly deliberating over how to share what he had discovered. "Kathleen, thank you for bringing this to me. If you had taken it elsewhere, it could have embarrassed the firm." I spoke with the court clerk, and while they usually require original documents, a photocopy of your statement was submitted for this injunction. The clerk suspects your signature was added through cut and paste. My heart sank. Knowing what was coming, Dinda Trent requested the injunction, acting on instructions from Mr. Woodward, who was very forceful. "Will handle Miss Trent appropriately. The injunction will be overturned tomorrow morning." He looked at me with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Kathleen. This was all Anthony's doing. He used the firm's name without approval." He walked around his desk and sat on the edge. "Are you okay? Do you want to sit for a bit, or maybe have some tea?" "No. Thank you, sir. I just need to get back to my children," I replied, holding myself steady. "Please call me Michael," he said, gently guiding me toward the door. I paused. "One more thing, Michael. What Anthony did kept my kids from their father for 3 months. I can't forgive that, and I don't think I can keep working here. Please don't make any decisions just yet," he urged. "Leighton, see what happens next week." I nodded in agreement and left his office, immediately calling Penny to let her know. I was on my way that night after the kids were asleep. I began to wonder what else Tony had interfered with. I pulled out all the legal documents from the past year and the photos fell out. Seeing them still made me sick. As I looked again, something clicked. The tattoo, Richard's tattoo, wasn't visible in any of the pictures. It wasn't Richard in those photos. I laid them out, realizing Richard's face was only visible in half of them, always with his eyes closed. I checked the divorce papers. The ground stated Richard Thompson did commit fidelity with Miss Ava Bell Andawa, but I had never known her name. Tony handled the divorce, because I was too upset. Where had the lawyer gotten that name? The next day, I started investigating. I searched for Ava Bell Andawa and found multiple payments to her, including one for $2,000 from Tony's cost center. I went to speak with Maggie, Tony's secretary. Hi, Kathy. What brings you here? You know Tony's away, right? Maggie greeted me as I walked into her office. Yes, I know, I replied. I was hoping you could help me with some audit questions. We found payments to a Miss Eva Bellinkawa. Do you know who she is? Maggie blushed slightly. Yes, unfortunately, she's an escort Mr. Woodward uses to keep certain clients happy. I don't approve, so he handles it directly. Do you have a file on her? I asked. Yeah, I'll grab it for you, she said, heading to a filing cabinet. Maggie returned with a file in hand. She's a beautiful girl. You think she could find a better way to make a living? She handed me the file, then asked hesitantly, Mr. Woodward isn't in any trouble? Is he nothing more than usual, Maggie? Don't worry, I reassured her. I waited until I got back to my office to open the file. As I reviewed it, Maggie's description was accurate. Eva was strikingly beautiful and intelligent with a degree from the University of Kiev. The photos in the files showed her in a much better light than those I'd seen during the divorce proceedings. I found her contact information and left her a message. She called me back around midday. Hello. This is Eva Bell Andawa. You called. Her voice came through the phone. Yes, I'm Kathleen Thompson from Pendleton, Sims and Woodcock. I'd like to discuss something with you. Could we meet for lunch? You work for Mr. Woodward. I already told him. I don't work for him anymore. Ava responded, sounding irritated. No, I don't work for him. This is a different matter. It's work-related, but not connected to Woodward. Fine, she said, her tone softening slightly. Name a time and place. Roberto at 1:30 p.m. I suggested. Okay, you pay. See you, then, at 130. Eva arrived fashionably late, drawing the attention of everyone in the restaurant. After we shook hands and ordered our meals, she didn't waste any time. What do you want? She asked bluntly. I slid a photo of Richard across the table. Her demeanor shifted immediately. Her cheerful expression vanished and she looked visibly upset. I told him I wouldn't do that again, she said sharply. You can tell him that. Tell who? I asked, confused. I don't work for Woodward, I'm Richard's ex-wife. Eva's eyes widened in surprise. She sat back down, taking a moment to process. Well, this is disappointing. He used to talk about how beautiful his wife was, and you're pretty. But anyway, what do you want? She said, her tone turning dismissive. After our food arrived and we ate mostly in silence, she explained, I'm an escort, yes, but I have self-respect. What happened that night made me lose it. Woodward paid me to hurt your husband. Your husband didn't deserve it. Heck, a good man. He refused to come to my room. He kept talking about his wonderful wife. I had to get him so drunk he could barely stand, then took him to a room Woodward had booked. He was too drunk to do anything. So Woodward took the photos himself, posing me with your husband and the ex that was Woodward. He said someone was going to do me for what he paid. He set the camera on a timer and did it himself. I took her hand. Nobody deserves that, Eva continued. Your husband was kind the next morning. He didn't even remember me. He apologized, thinking he never met me before. I explained that Richard used that line with all attractive women, but she understood he genuinely didn't remember her. I helped Woodward blackmail him, and that makes me feel terrible. I'm glad Richard didn't do what Woodward wanted. I'm sorry, Eva, he's not my husband anymore. We divorced because of those pictures. Eva and I talked for another half hour. She was kind and easy to talk to, and I could see why men would be drawn to her afterward. I returned to the office and called Mr. Pendleton, who asked for details on the payments to Eva concerned. He requested a full review of all the transactions. I called my mother to ask her to take Tom and Maddie for the night. I didn't want them in the house when Tony came home. My mind was racing. The man I thought had betrayed me hadn't, and the one I trusted had been behind all my problems. I sat at my desk crying, feeling overwhelmed. Brenda eventually came and listened as I poured out everything, and then started asking questions. Do you love Tony? She asked. No, I don't think so. Maybe I never did. I admitted. How do you feel about Richard? She continued. I sighed. I'm ashamed. Eva made him sound like the perfect husband. A year ago, you'd have agreed with her. Brenda reminded me. I would have, I said softly. I wish I'd never seen those photos. Well, you divorced him like anyone would have in your position, she said, trying to comfort me. I should have listened to him, I replied, regret heavy in my voice. It's easy to say that now, Brenda said gently. Go home and think about what you're going to do next. I don't have time, I said, shaking my head. Tony's coming back tonight, and I know what I need to do. When I got home, I packed Tony's belongings into 2 large suitcases by 5:00 p.m. Everything was ready. I sat with a glass of wine, thinking about how I would tell Richard what I had uncovered. When Tony walked in and saw the suitcases, he looked confused. What's all this? Are we going somewhere? He asked. No, I said calmly. You are moving out. What? He said, his voice rising in disbelief. I know about the injunction, Tony. I spoke to Eva. I want you out of my house and out of my life. Let's talk about this, he said, grabbing my shoulders and pushing me toward the dining room. His grip tightened painfully. I'm not leaving. I put too much into this, Tony. You're hurting me, I said, trying to pull away. Oh, now you notice, he sneered, tightening his hold even more. Sit down and I'll tell you how it's going to be. As we entered the dining room, I felt a chair behind me. I pushed his hands off me, accidentally scratching his nose and making it bleed. Furious, he swung his hand to slap me, but I caught his wrist, spun him and threw him to the floor. Thanks to the self-defense lessons Richard had insisted. I held Tony's wrist down and pressed my foot against his chest. Why, Tony? What did Richard ever do to you? I demanded. Nothing, he spat. He had what I wanted, so I took it. You don't care about me. You just wanted the image, I said, my voice cold. Exactly. He admitted the business world trusts family men. I'd never make partner. As a single guy, I saw a shortcut. Marry, you be a family man. In a year you're attractive. The kids are cute. I had it all. I pressed my heel harder into his ribs. Say one more thing and I'll give you real heartache. Then I knew what I wanted. I let go of his wrist, stood up and picked up the phone. I dialed. Richard. Richard, can you come over? I need to talk to you. No, the kids are fine. It's about something else. Oh, and bring your rifle. I hung up and looked at Tony. You've got 5 to 10 minutes before he gets here. Do you really want to be here when I tell him what you did? You think I'm scared of him? You don't know him. You tried to take away the most important thing in his life, his kids. That makes them dangerous. Now get up and pack your things before it's too late. As Tony was leaving, Richard pulled up in his old Volvo, watching the red BMW drive away. I opened the door and hugged him, but he stiffened like I was hugging a stranger. He gently pulled my arms away. What do you want? Kath, you've already taken everything from me, and since when do I own a rifle? Richard asked, his tone bitter. I paused, realizing how much damage there was to repair. The man who once loved and trusted me now saw ulterior motives and everything I did. It's not like that, Richard. I just want to talk and explain, I said, trying to sound calm. He glanced past me, his eyes narrowing. Wasn't that your boyfriend driving off? What is he coming back with the police to arrest me? There's no injunction and Tony's not coming back. Please just come inside, I pleaded reluctantly. Richard followed me into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, clearly ready to bolt at any moment. Can I get you a drink? I offered, trying to ease the tension. Sparkling, water or coffee? Please, I don't drink anymore, not since that night, when everything fell apart, he said quietly. I made his coffee just the way he liked it and handed it to him. Where are you living now? I asked, trying to make small talk with Rob at the scrapyard, sleeping in one of the kids' rooms. He replied, they've been great to me. Even let me have the old Volvo. How's work? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They let me go 6 months ago. I was useless after everything happened, he admitted, staring at the floor. I get some contract work now. You've still been making the payments on time. I noted, my kids aren't going to suffer because I messed up, he said firmly, his words cut deep. You're not making this easy, I said, feeling the weight of what I was about to confess. Why should I? He shot back. You threw me out and took everything over one mistake. That's the thing, Richard, you didn't make a mistake, I said softly. He looked at me confused. What do you mean? You didn't sleep with her? It was all a setup. She told me. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice breaking. His anger shifted to disbelief. But those photos, some were of you, but the rest were of Tony, I explained. Eva told me everything. She's ashamed of her part in it and wants to help. Richard just stared at me, trying to process what I just told him. I went to the kitchen, tears welling up. Seeing how much pain Richard was in tore me apart. I brought him his coffee and sat down with my glass of wine. He took a sip and gave a small smile. You still make great coffee, he said. Then, after a pause, he added, now tell me how Tony set me up. I explained everything, asking him not to call Tony Loverboy because it was never love. Richard listened, calm on the surface, but I could tell he was processing everything quietly, and that worried me. Richard, please don't do anything rash, I pleaded. We need you stay here tonight. You'll feel better in the morning. He shook his head. I can't stay. I've got a date tonight. Don't worry, I won't do anything stupid. When Richard mentioned a date, it felt like a punch to the stomach. I hadn't considered that he might have moved on. Even though I had lived with Tony for 6 months, I winced as he stood to leave, feeling the weight of lost time. Desperate, I used the only card I had left. The kids are eager to see you. Could you come by tomorrow? I asked. Really, you'd be okay with that? He asked, his surprise evident. Of course. Of course, I replied. You can pick them up from Mom's tomorrow and I'll stay there until Sunday night. You can have time with them here or take them out. Tears wet in his eyes as I handed him the house keys. Are you sure? He asked, his voice soft. There, your children too? You should see them whenever you want. As he left, he turned and said, thanks, Kath, I'll be here around 100. I've got something in the morning. Later, I called Mom to explain what had happened. She wasn't surprised. She'd never liked Tony, always calling him a creep, why little man, and she believed from the start that I should have given Richard another chance. In her mind, you stood by your man. She still called Richard her son-in-law and was thrilled at the thought of seeing him again. Richard arrived at 130 the next day and Mom insisted we all have lunch together. It was the first time in over a year we had sat down as a family, and she loved every minute of it. As Richard left with the kids, she kissed him on the cheek and told him to come back soon. After they left, Mom turned to me. So, what's your plan now? I sighed, feeling overwhelmed. I don't know, Mom, it's all such a mess. Do you think you can rebuild your life with them? He still loves you. You know, I'm not sure, I admitted. He's so hurt and angry he'll calm down, she said confidently, especially now that he can see the kids. That was a smart move. I'll try, I said, unsure, but I'm going to need help. Mom nodded, her voice firm. Then start eating humble pie and building alliances. She was right. If I wanted Richard back, I'd have to start with his family. The weekend went well. Mom and I grew closer, united in purpose. I returned home Sunday evening just in time to help Richard put the kids to bed. They were happy and full of stories about their time with him afterward. I offered Richard sparkling water and suggested he pick the kids up from school. Sometimes we parted on good terms. Giving me hope, Monday arrived too quickly and I was nervous about facing Tony. I had my resignation letter ready but decided to honor my commitment to Michael Pendleton. I watched Tony arrive looking confident while I failed to notice a white truck parking next to his BMW. Tony, fresh from a successful trip, was in high spirits. His secretary greeted him warmly as he headed to his office. "Mr. Pendleton wants to see you right away," she said. Tony dropped off his briefcase and made his way to the top floor. He walked into Michael Pendleton's office, ready to share his success. Before he could speak, Michael pulled out a file and said, "I'm glad to hear about the new client, Anthony. But that's not why I called you. It seems you've been up to some mischief using the firm's name." Tony looked confused. "I'm sorry, Michael, I don't understand. Do you deny pressuring Devin D. Trant into filing an injunction against Richard Thompson?" Anthony began to feel uneasy. "Yes, I did request the injunction, but it was urgent. He was threatening Kathy and me. We needed protection." So you deny submitting false evidence for that injunction?" "Yes, of course." "Then, can you provide the original statement signed by Mrs. Thompson?" "She denies making one and claims the allegations are false." "You only provided a copy, so where's the original?" "Damn," Anthony muttered, standing abruptly. He noticed the two security guards who had quietly entered the office from that reaction. "I assume it's true," Michael said coldly. "Please sit down." "We're not finished." Anthony knew his career at Pendleton, Sims and Woodcock was over. Now he wondered how bad it would get. "Next, there are some accounting issues. We have records of payments to Miss Eva Balawa, all signed by you. You've listed these expenses as entertainment. What exactly was she doing for us?" Anthony hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "Michael, sometimes keeping clients happy means doing things we're not proud of." Michael leaned back, his expression cold. "So which client did she entertain when you paid her double?" "I'd have to check my records," Anthony replied, avoiding eye contact. "Miss Binka says you used her to blackmail a client." Michael pressed. "That's not true." "He wasn't a client," Anthony shot back defensively. Michael raised his hand, cutting him off. "I've heard enough. We're handing everything over to the police. You'll likely face charges and the Law Society may revoke your license. These gentlemen will escort you to your office. You have 1 hour to collect your things." Anthony left the building. His confidence drained, his mood darkened further. When he spotted Richard standing by his parking space, a box of Anthony's belongings at his feet. As Anthony approached, Richard set the box down and glared at him. Too late to act. "Tough, Richard, move," Anthony snapped. Richard gestured toward the parking space, revealing a red metal cube. A crushed car. Anthony's eyes widened as he recognized the remnants of his BMW. The badge still attached. Furious, he swung at Richard, his fist barely grazing him. Richard retaliated swiftly, kicking Anthony between the legs and driving his knee into Anthony's face, knocking him to the ground. Anthony, bleeding and struggling to stand, looked up just as 2 police officers arrived. "Perfect timing, officers," Anthony said, trying to regain his composure. "I want this man charged with assault." One of the officers stepped forward. "And your name is Anthony Woodward," he replied confidently. The officer's expression shifted. "Anthony Woodward, you are under arrest for conspiracy to blackmail. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you fail to mention something you later rely on in court." As the officers cuffed him, Anthony protested. "What about his attack on me?" "You saw it." "Yes, we saw you swing first," and he responded with reasonable force to defend himself. The officer replied calmly, then turned to Richard. "Here are our badge numbers in case you want to press charges." Anthony, still fuming, pointed toward the metal cube. "Look what he did to my car." The officer glanced over. "Your car? You mean the red BMW over there?" He pointed to an intact vehicle parked across the lot. Another officer placed Anthony's belongings inside it before leading him toward the patrol car. Richard followed his voice, calm and measured. Get used to this, Woodward. There are plenty of laws against what you did, and I'll make sure you're held accountable for every single one. You tried to take everything from me, but now it's my turn. As the patrol car pulled away, Rob arrived in a truck using a crane to lift the scrap metal cube. He jumped down with a grin and high-fived Richard. Oh, Richie, his face was priceless. What about phase 2 in a week or so you'll be driving a new Beamer? Richard replied, smiling back in the office. Brenda walked in and said, Kath, you've got to see what's happening in the parking lot. I went to the window and watched as Anthony was driven away in a police car. Richard and his brother Rob were in the parking lot laughing and loading something onto the back of Rob's truck. They high-fived and slapped each other on the back. I hoped whatever they were up to wouldn't get Richard in trouble. It would devastate the kids if he was taken away again. After lunch, Michael Pendleton called. He explained what had happened and asked if I still wanted to resign with Tony gone. There was no point in leaving. He reassured me that Tony acted alone and that the firm didn't condone his actions, likely worried about any legal action Richard or I might take by the end of the day. Most people had forgotten about the incident. I picked up the kids from school and saw Richard talking with Penny. They both smiled, and when the kids saw Richard, they ran to him shouting, Daddy. He hugged them tightly, and Tom eagerly asked if Richard could come home with us. Richard looked at me and I nodded, bringing a genuine smile to his face. I suggested the kids ride in Richard's car, and they didn't care that it was old and beat up. They were just happy to be with their dad. Richard stayed until the kids were asleep before he left. I tried to talk to him about what I'd seen earlier. You and Rob are up to something. Aren't you pleased? I'll do anything that will get you in trouble. We can't lose you again. Richard reassured me. Don't worry, I'm taking him down, but my kids won't be visiting me in prison. That night Tony's car disappeared from the company lot. The police found it the next day, burned out in the woods. Richard sued Tony for damages, including child support, reputation damage and damage to our marriage, valuing it at £200,000. He was determined to destroy Tony, but I just wanted it all to be over. Richard and Rob couldn't stop laughing as they worked on the red BMW. Rob explained how they reprogrammed a blank key to steal the car and removed its identifying marks. They used parts from a wrecked car to swap the ID numbers, ensuring the car would be untraceable. Richard asked, can he prove it's his car? Not a chance, Rob said. The burnout car was crushed. Your new ride is squeaky clean. Richard then mentioned Hune's out on bail. Now think he'll get off, not with Eve testifying, Rob replied. Richard was intrigued by Eva, surprised by how nice she turned out to be. Despite her job with immunity, she agreed to testify further, sealing Tony's fate. Richard smiled, knowing he now had the upper hand. As they finished, Richard said, I hope he goes crazy when he sees me with his car. Maybe even attacks me, so I can get him arrested again. Rob chuckled, and he called you a chicken. You fight the battles you can win, Rob, and right now I've got all the big weapons on my side. As they walked back to the bungalow, Richard thought about what his brother had said. So when did you talk to Kath? I didn't, but she's been talking to Vicky. They're getting close again. You're right. I need to figure things out with her, but first I need to deal with him. 2 weeks after Tony's arrest, Richard arrived at school in a new car. Maddie immediately noticed. Daddy, why are you driving Uncle Tony's car? It's not Uncle Tony's car, sweetheart, it just looks like it. It's identical. She insisted. I couldn't help but ask, where did you get the money for this? I bought it from Rob. It's an insurance write-off, only cost me £1,000 and I got $200 for the Volvo. Don't worry, I've got it covered, he said with a grin that suggested there was more to the story. Since getting the car, Richard drove everywhere, which didn't go unnoticed by friends who commented on its resemblance to Tony's. For me, it was a constant reminder of what Tony had done to us. Richard was still living with Rob and Vicky and refused my offers to stay over to make things harder. He was dating He said it was nothing serious, but it worried me. He was single and anything could happen. I hoped his tattoo would scare off potential love interests, though I knew that was wishful thinking every day. I regretted my mistakes watching Richard with the kids. Seeing the love he had for them reminded me of how he used to love me as the trials approached. I hoped that, once it was over, we could rebuild our life together. Richard attended the trials, the first involving misappropriation of funds. Eva Balawa was the key witness, explaining how Anthony had paid her to seduce Richard under the guise of business. She cried as she revealed she had been misled, portraying herself as an innocent Ukrainian woman manipulated by Anthony as she left the stand. She smiled at Richard that evening. Eva waited for Richard and invited him to dinner. He was impressed by her intelligence and beauty, understanding why she commanded high fees. As they ate, Richard noticed the envious glances from other men in the restaurant. When the coffee arrived, Eva reached across the table and placed her hand gently on Richard's. "Would you like to come home with me tonight?" she asked softly. Richard, taking aback, replied, "You don't owe me anything." "I know," Eva said, her voice sincere. "I'm not offering out of obligation. I want to. I've been with many men, but tonight I want to be with you. You're a good man, and I think it will be good for both of us." When the bill came, Eva insisted on paying using her diner card. They took a cab to her flat. Once there, Richard stood by the window gazing out across the river, while Eva poured drinks. "Are you sure you just want water?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's the only thing I'm sure of right now," Richard replied, his voice steady. Eva handed him a glass, then looped her arm around his and kissed him softly. "Now, you're sober. There are no cameras and you're a free man. Let's enjoy ourselves." "Yes," Richard smiled faintly. "Oh yes," he said, pulling her closer. She led him to the bedroom. They made love, and afterward, as they lay together in silence, Richard remained lost in thought, sensing his unease. Eva kissed him gently, as if answering the unspoken question on his mind. "Thank you, darling. That was wonderful," she said softly. Richard smiled wryly. "I bet you say that to all the guys, to clients." "Yes, because they pay to hear it," Eva admitted, "but I mean it with you. Most men just take what they want. You make love to me, and that makes me feel special. Kathy's a lucky woman." "Not anymore, we're divorced. Remember," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. Eva smiled knowingly. "You'll go back to her once the anger fades." "I know it." Richard looked at her surprised. "How can you be so sure? Is this your way of saying you don't want to see me again?" "No, I enjoy being with you," AA reassured him, "but I won't give up my work." "You wouldn't be okay with that." Richard was silent for a moment, then Eva added, "And besides, you're still in love with her. That's why it hurts so much." "What makes you think she wants me back?" Richard asked, doubt creeping into his voice. "She does," Eva said, confidently. "Trust me," Richard exhaled. "So what now?" AA said with a smile. "We shower and sleep. Tomorrow we make love again before court." The next day in court, Anthony pleaded guilty and asked for leniency. His lawyer argued that his legal career was over and he offered to repay the stolen funds. The judge gave him a 3-year sentence, suspended for 5. Richard was furious, expecting a harsher punishment. He left the courtroom to cool off, and when Anthony walked by smiling, Richard wanted to react, but felt Eva's calming hand. "One lawyer won't punish another," she reminded him. "I thought he'd go down. A mom gets jail for stealing milk and he walks after stealing thousands." Richard fumed. Eva reassured him that the blackmail charge was still pending, which helped calm him down. Richard didn't visit the kids for 2 days, clearly upset. "I called Vicky, and she said he hadn't returned home right after court. I worried until I got a text. Don't worry, he's back." It took another day for Richard to visit the kids. They greeted him like he'd been gone for months. That night he told me about the trial, but I couldn't match his anger. "I just wanted to move forward and leave Tony behind." Vicky and Rob discussed Richard staying with them longer than expected. Rob suggested he move back into our house, but Richard wasn't sure. Vicky jumped in, urging him to give it a chance, reminding him I was the one who exposed Tony and helped take him down. Richard wasn't convinced, still feeling hurt over the past, but she slept with the man who set me up. He argued. Vicky calmly pointed out that I kicked Tony out as soon as I learned the truth and tried to fix things. Having Richard around was helpful. He often picked up the kids and stayed for dinner, but there was still distance between us when he mentioned needing to find a place to live. I suggested he move in with us, reminding him he was already paying the mortgage. He eventually agreed. After moving back, things didn't progress as I'd hoped. 4 weeks in, we still weren't sharing a bed, and he continued going out a few nights a week, often not coming home until the next day. I knew someone else was still in his life. We grew closer as a family in some ways, spending weekends together and attending the kids' school events from the outside. We probably looked like a normal family. My friend Penny even asked if we were planning to remarry, but I broke down, telling her we slept in separate rooms and I suspected he had a girlfriend. Things worsened when Maddie, upset about sharing her room, innocently asked, "Why can't Daddy sleep in your bed?" Her childlike logic hit hard, especially when she pointed out you weren't married to Tony, but he slept in your bed. The silence was crushing. Richard overheard, stood up, grabbed his coat and left, saying, "I'm going for a walk." Maddie started crying, asking if Daddy would come back. I assured her he would, and he did return later to tuck the kids in, though he went straight to his room afterward. That moment set us back when the blackmail charge against Tony was dropped. I feared it would break Richard, but I was somewhat relieved you wouldn't have to lie in court, something I knew he couldn't do. I tried to console Richard after the blackmail charge was dropped. We could sue him in civil court and take whatever money he has, I suggested, but that wasn't enough for Richard. He wanted Anthony in prison to lift his spirits. I suggested taking the kids swimming that weekend. Penny and her kids joined us. Playing with the children seemed to cheer him up, and he even started teaching Maddie how to swim. Penny kept staring at Richard and I nudged her. "Hey, that's my husband you're ogling." She laughed. "Don't you mean ex-husband? I'm working on that," I said with a grin. "You better hurry once Hugh's back to himself, there's going to be a line," she teased, watching him swim. I realized she was right. He looked great, and I noticed some women watching him too. I turned to Penny and said, "I'm going to fix him, and when I do he'll be all mine." Penny chuckled. "Good luck with that." "What's your secret weapon?" "Those two," I said, pointing to Maddie and Tom. "He won't go far as long as I've got them, and I'll make sure he never wants to after swimming," Richard suggested. "We all go to Pizza Hut." It was a perfect end to the day as we walked out of the mall. He held my hand, and I felt a spark of hope until I saw Tony. He smirked at us. Well, looks like my cast-offs found someone to take care of them," Richard calmly replied. "As I recall, she threw you out," Tony sneered. "All the charges are dropped." "You really thought you could take me down?" Richard guided the kids away, but Tony followed, taunting him. "What now, big man, going to roll over?" Like always, Richard turned to Penny. "Can you take the kids home?" "Please." Penny quickly bundled the children into her car. Sensing trouble, Richard and I headed toward the BMW, but Tony ran after us, shouting, "That's my car. You stole it!" Before Richard could react, Tony punched him, knocking him to the ground. He kicked Richard while he was down, and I dialed the police, trying to pull Tony away, but he shoved me to the ground. Richard winked at me, then, with a swift move, struck Tony in the groin, sending him reeling. Richard followed up, punching Tony's jaw and pinning him to the ground. "I think you just activated your suspended sentence," Richard said coldly. "It's your word against mine," Tony groaned. Richard nodded toward a CCTV camera. Big Brother's watching. That cameras caught everything as the police arrived. They pulled Richard off Tony. Paramedics treated both men. Richard had broken ribs and Tony had a broken jaw. Richard and I rode in the ambulance together. Despite his pain, he smiled. "He's going down, Kath. We won't see him for a few years." I smiled through tears. "I just wish the car didn't remind me of him, then we'll get it repainted," he said, squeezing my hand. I couldn't hold back anymore and cried. "I'm so sorry, Richard. This is all my fault. no, it's his fault and now he's going to pay. Richard was right. He had broken ribs and liver damage, but after 2 days in the hospital he came home. Tony, with his jaw wired shut, was taken into police custody. Rob collected the BMW and a week later, the police came to inspect Tony's claims. After checking the documents, they said, "We had nothing to worry about." I insisted Richard used the master bedroom. I slept beside him for the first few nights to make sure he was okay, though we only slept. Waking up next to him felt like heaven. After 2 weeks, he moved back to his own room, and while we were closer, it wasn't quite what I had hoped. Unfortunately, once he was well, Richard went out again and didn't return until the next day. Eva called a couple of times. While he was recovering, worried about him. Once he was better, they met up, but Richard sensed something was wrong at her flat. He asked, "What's bothering you, Evie?" "It's not you," she said with a sad smile. "It's me. I like you too much, Richard, but you have your children and I know you can't leave them. I can't keep doing this. You deserve better." They spent the night together, knowing it would be their last the next morning. They parted on good terms, but Richard was quieter when he came home. He didn't talk much about it, and I didn't push him over the following weeks. It seemed like he had broken things off for good. He wasn't going out as much anymore. It took a month for Richard to fully recover, but he never stopped playing with the kids. By the time Tony's trial came up, we were getting along much better. We were both called as witnesses along with Penny before the trial. The prosecution warned us Tony might claim provocation, though the CCTV footage was clear. Penny was a star witness, calmly recounting how Richard had asked her to take the children away to avoid a fight. When the defense asked why, Penny replied, "It was obvious. Mr. Woodward was itching for a fight. Mr. Thompson didn't want his kids to see him getting hurt." Her answer was simple and honest, and I could almost see the jurors marking Richard as a good dad and family man. The judge sentenced Tony to 10 years, plus 3 more from his suspended sentence. He might be out in years with good behavior, but for now Richard felt relieved. The civil case for damages was still pending, but with Tony in prison, Richard was much happier. Tony's accounts were frozen until the case was settled, and during this time Richard and I grew closer, though we still hadn't rekindled our physical relationship. We shared our thoughts and dreams, but the unresolved tension was frustrating. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly slipped into Richard's bed and kissed him. He responded and we made love just like I had longed for, but afterward, he gently told me I needed to go back to my room, saying it would confuse the kids if they found us together. His rejection stung, and I cried myself to sleep. It took a week for things to feel normal between us again. Our relationship improved slowly with moments of closeness, followed by Richard retreating to his own space. I knew I had to make a bold move. In February 2012, I prepared his favorite dinner, put champagne on ice, and after the kids were in bed, I put on a white silk kimono. I knelt in front of him holding his hand. "Richard Thompson, will you marry me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He was surprised, but eventually slid my old engagement ring onto my finger. I was overjoyed and pulled out the champagne. He teased me, but we both knew it was a turning point. He carried me upstairs, and that night felt like a fresh start. The next morning, Maddie saw us together and asked, "Mommy, are you and Daddy married now?" "Not yet, but soon," I replied, and she eagerly asked to be a bridesmaid. Moments later, Tom joined us in bed. It was a perfect family moment, but I knew we still had work to do over the next 6 months. We both went to counseling to deal with our issues. Richard needed to release his anger, and I had to forgive myself. Finally, last August we got married with Maddie as our bridesmaid. During the civil case, Tony's solicitor offered us his 2 rental properties as a settlement, and Richard agreed on the condition that they also covered our legal costs. Richard mostly stuck to his no booze rule, occasionally having just 1 drink. His contract work grew and his old company even offered him his job back. He declined, pointing out that his contractor rate was much higher and now he's employed at a higher level than his former boss. When winning back Richard's family has been challenging, but as they see how happy he is, they're starting to forgive me. I'm hopeful this time we'll make it for good. I'm going to turn this one over to you. What do you make of this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting involved in today's stories. Your love, support, and time mean the world to me. So, thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and much love.